Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Shot. You'll see that I am in unfamiliar surrounds today. That is because, unfortunately, when we went to upload our episode this week, we noticed that we had had some technical gremlins with our Riverside platform, of which we had not been aware at the time of recording. That meant that I did not appear on screen at all. I couldn't hear me, couldn't see me, I was nowhere. So there was some quite odd moments where I was banging on and asking the questions. And we had our three fabulous guests, stand-in co-host Joel Jenkins, the indomitable Michael Pascoe, and making her debut on the Sunday Shot was the managing editor of the Australia Institute Press, Alice Grundy, who is the co-editor of a great new book, A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage. But yes, our three guests were just sort of staring, listening to me, while all you, our audience, would have been able to hear was silence. So in order to salvage what we could, I am just going to let you know what I had asked of our panelists, and then you'll hear some great commentary from them. The good news is that when we go to the interview after, I appear back on screen. So the first 20 minutes or so is without me. Great interview from Dave with Ogie Simic from the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, and then normal transmission resumes, as it were. So in the rundown of the news of the week, I first asked Michael about the goings on of the Trump administration in the South Atlantic Sea. He's written a great piece for Michael West Media about that. A bit more attention finally focused on these extrajudicial killings. Basically asking whether or not when the order was given, was it by Hegseth? Was it by Mitch Bradley to go back in on the September 2 killings and kill the survivors? Is that a war crime? Now, of course, that's dependent on whether or not you think that there's a war going on at all. If there is a war against narco-terrorists, as Trump and Hegseth like to say, it certainly hasn't been endorsed by and approved by Congress. Slightly odd if you're saying that the drugs are such a scourge on the US that you need to go about killing fishermen in the sea at the same time as you pardon the former president of Honduras, ex-president Hernandez, who had been convicted of drug smuggling and facilitating the importation of tons and tons of cocaine, such that he had been sentenced by an American court to 45 years in jail. Anyway, that said, as I say, I asked Michael to expand a little bit on his article and his thoughts on the South Atlantic shenanigans.
Joe, this is an example of how the Trump administration manages to find a way to shock you, even when you think surely they can't do anything worse than they've just done. And this is what they have managed to do. The whole question of being at war with drug smugglers, justifying extrajudicial killings, slaughtering 80 plus people in the Caribbean so far, that is incredible. But what came to light on Friday night, courtesy of the Washington Post, was the euphemism of a double tap. That on the very first attack on a Venezuelan speedboat, there were two survivors clinging to the wreckage in the water minutes after the attack. And those survivors were then murdered. The details that people haven't been following, the Washington Post reported that Hegseth gave the order, kill everybody. When there were survivors spotted, Admiral Mitch Bradley, from the comfort of his air-conditioned office in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, sent another missile and blew them out of the water, blew them to pieces. Now, that, if it's a war, it's clearly a war crime. If it's not a war, it's straight out murder anyway. And the obvious precedent here is the matter of Heinz Wilhelm Eck, who was a U-boat commander in the South Atlantic in World War II, uh, torpedoed a Greek freighter. There were survivors. They machine gunned hand grenades and small arms sought to kill all those survivors in the water. A couple survived. Eck and two others were found guilty at Nuremberg and executed by firing squad. What is the difference between Heinz Wilhelm Eck and Pete Hegseth and Admiral Mitch Bradley? There is no question about this whatsoever. There are several things that run for this. Sorry that I'm rabbiting on about it, but this has to be the straw. Thanks. This really should be the straw that would break an ordinary camel's back. That we have embedded our own military with a rogue military state, with a state that is committing war crimes, that is murdering survivors in the water. This is so bad, even some Republican politicians aren't happy with it. And you know how bad something must be before any of the MAGA mob begin to think twice about it. What are we doing with our own service people embedded in that regime? And we do. I sent a request to Miles' PR department asking how many personnel Australia has embedded. There was no answer, no reply. We know there's something like 193 Australian civilians and service personnel in the US just working on the AUKUS submarine side of things, but there are more in various arms of the US military machine. How can we persist with that? Another bit of contrast, on Wednesday night in the House of Commons in the UK, there were questions raised about was there any British involvement in what was happening off the Venezuelan coast. The Brits at least talk about it. What was happening in Australian politics? The only issue of concern here this past week has been the price of some last-minute tickets to New York. Where on earth is the perspective? Where on earth is any sense of decency and ethics that Australia, to quote a former head of the Australian Army, the standard you walk by is the standard you accept? We are so cowed, we are so weak, we are such a vassal state that we are not game to even whisper about what is happening on our watch.
I then asked Michael if, with the extra scrutiny that was coming on these activities this week, did he think that there could be some kind of consequences, that there may be some accountability from members of the Trump administration, whether it was Mitch Bradley, whether it's Hegseth, probably not Trump himself, that there may be some repercussions?
There are a couple of things on different levels operating here, Joe. The biggest picture is America, for all the talk about a rules-based order that we keep parroting, America doesn't believe in any rules-based order, aside from whatever rules it wants to make up from time to time. It's not a party to the International Court of Justice. It never signed the law of the sea. It will not accept any of its service personnel being tried for anything they do anywhere on earth. And then you have the higher levels of absurdity now, with the Supreme Court basically saying Trump, as commander-in-chief, is above the law. And as far as the Trump regime is concerned, anything anyone wants to do is above the law. So there's no possibility here of any international comeback legally for these war crimes, because America just says, nah, we don't care, we don't believe in it, you've got nothing to do with us. That's the biggest picture, and that has always been the case. What we've seen with Hegseth is what I've described as the standard behaviour of a worm caught in a trap. That the first instinct of a worm caught in a scandal is to deny, which is, of course, is what Hegseth did. And then the next stage, when it couldn't be denied anymore, when the story was effectively being confirmed, you try to distance yourself. Then you end up moving on from denial to distancing to justifying, and finally, what hasn't happened yet is you look for a distraction. And that's what we should all fear. What distraction would this Secretary for Defence, the Trump regime, come up with to distract from this specific crime against humanity in the context of Venezuela? And it looks like, Trump is talking about beginning to attack on land in Venezuela, because he's got the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen, heavily stationed off the Venezuelan coast. So you've got this cascading disaster, and in this case, Hegseth and Trump have both said on the record that Bradley was entirely justified. He did the right thing. We've got your back. So it would be difficult for them now to flick it all onto Bradley. Should there ever be a Justice Department again in the United States, should there be a change in administration, it is certainly possible to see a Justice Department going after Bradley, and Hegseth, of course, will then run a million miles if he's not caught up in it too.
Michael, I just wanted to ask you a bit of a question. What we're seeing right now in the US also is a bit of a bipartisan buy-in in both the media and the political class to this, Monroe 2.0 revivalism that happens. And I think it's a little bit indicative of, how the US views its conflicts abroad. And the ones closer to home seem to have a little bit more buy-in across the political class. I just want to quote Megyn Kelly, who was on stage the other day, who said, quote, "I would like Trump and Hegseth to make it last a long time so they lose a limb and bleed out." Speaking of the survivors in the water there. Those survivors were hit primarily because the ones that weren't hit ended up being innocent and were interviewed on state television. And this also comes after the resignation of Southcom commander, due to the nature of the crimes themselves. So, but we can also look at Mamdani, for example, who, called Venezuela, and Maduro a dictator, an authoritarian dictator. And there seems to be, a little bit of a buy-in from across American society into these Monroe 2.0 conflicts. But I want to ask you a little bit around, the importance of Australia adhering to international law here, which seems to be such an important part of us surviving as a middle power. And what risk does it pose for our government and our country, supporting these illegal wars of aggression or tacitly allowing them to go by, like the one in Venezuela?
Joel, that's another big area to open up. I think the most damaging part of it is what it does to a reputation with the majority of the world, which is not part of Team USA. We have this problem that we view the world through an American lens most of the time, and our Australian lens is an American lens. We have this idea that you have to be with the US or with China. Most of the world is neither. Our most important neighbours are neither. Indonesia, Malaysia, India, for all of its membership of the Quad, are not on Team USA. They do not have to be complicit and keep quiet about this sort of war crime, this sort of transgression, wherever it occurs in the world. But we, on a bipartisan basis, and I think at an average level in our community, see us as inextricably linked with an American view. It's what we watch on television. Their mythology is mythology we grew up with. The Wild West, World War II, is all our history, primarily seen as an American story. And therefore we have this warped sense of what's important and what we have to do. The people most important to our future don't share that. And they look at us time and again, and what do they see? America's deputy dog in the South Pacific. It's a role we explicitly have taken on, that we acknowledge, that we're almost proud of. And when you have a United States regime as corrupt, as criminal, as evil as this one, we're their willing deputy. We are not game to criticise in the least. And that, I think, is sorrowful. That, I think, betrays my faith in Australian government. And it's bipartisan. Both sides of Parliament are equally bad on this particular regard. One side probably worse. But it's the government that counts, and this government continues to betray us by betraying what should be our own principles.
Turning to domestic news, we heard this week that the man who doesn't know how to take no for an answer in all sorts of ways, Mr. Bruce Lehrmann, had had his appeal rejected by the full court of the federal court. In fact, the bench went further than Justice Lee had done in his decision and found that not only was Lehrmann reckless as to whether or not Brittany Higgins had consented to sexual intercourse, he knew that she had not. So one step further than in the primary judgment. I asked Alice for her thoughts.
Yes, and his lawyer said that he could be an inspiration for people. She said that outside the court after the judgment was delivered. The only inspiration I can see is for bankruptcy. I don't see a particularly bright future for that. But if you'll forgive me a little bit of optimism, at least as a result, or in part as a result of these series of trials, we have actually seen a code of conduct come into place for members of parliament at the federal parliament. There are some changes in terms of how alcohol is kept and how people use alcohol in Parliament House. And so there have been some changes that are a little bit positive. But yes, we're following that one, and we're also waiting to see the result of the Toowoomba trial.
The Toowoomba trial, of course, being Bruce Lehrmann's trial for rape, which is being heard next year. And he'll be back in court in Tasmania as well for the theft of a motor vehicle. This is the omnishambles that keeps on giving. The courts still have Linda Reynolds before them. She's suing the Commonwealth and its lawyers over the handling of Brittany Higgins' compensation claim. And Fiona Brown also has a Fair Work case against the Commonwealth, claiming she was not accorded a duty of care when in the Morrison office where she was working in 2021. So there's a lot still going on in the courts.
Yes, and the media seems to continue to be hungry for it as well. I suppose in the post-Me Too era, there is some hunger for seeing repercussions for really hideous behaviour. And, I, like a lot of people, really enjoyed Lee's judgment, not just his finding, but also the way it was written. And so it seems like there is an opportunity to change the conversation here, to make sure that more people are held accountable and to shift the debate. But I think the real shame on the other side is anyone who is watching these proceedings who has suffered sexual assault themselves will be really worried about coming forward about it, about reporting it. The idea of putting yourself through what Higgins has gone through, being really publicly flayed regularly, especially in the Australian newspaper, it's an incredibly high cost to pay. And seeing the way that these cases have played out, I think plenty of people will choose not to go down that path.
We finally saw this week as well the release of the so-called Jobs for Mates report, the Briggs report into the way that appointments are made. This report came about because Sophie Scomps, the independent member for Mackellar, introduced a private members bill seeking to ban the kind of handouts of jobs to political mates, to implement some kind of process, which is exactly indeed what Briggs finally recommended. The report had been sat on by the government for over 2 years and was only released because of David Pocock's activities in the Senate, where he insisted that the report be released this year. Otherwise, he was going to keep extending extending question time in the Senate, which would no doubt have made for completely riveting viewing. So I asked Joel for his thoughts on the report, which came out in the kind of taking out the trash time of Friday afternoon after the final parliamentary sitting day for the year.
Well, in quotation, overpaid political hacks really stood out there. And, you know, what else stood out was the fact that there is a bipartisan culture in place in situ where both are trying to benefit from this bipartisan pig trough where you allow your mates to come in and the jobs for mates sort of saga continues across, you know, all forms of our society where you see staffers, former politicians, and even like friends of these people appointed sometimes before elections with not much regard for the consequence or the public interest. So yeah, we are stacking our, you know, bureaucracies with people that are working in concert with, you know, directly with people in politics and in the private sector. So it is quite alarming the fact that, you know, Labor has come in, you know, under this, you know, with this cloak of the knack on them, and they, you know, they came out saying they were going to do things differently. But as you said, with Jay Weatherill, with all these appointments, it's just business as usual from our bipartisan political class.
I cited Karen Middleton, who'd written for the Monthly, that there was something comedic about ordering a review citing transparency and accountability and then hiding its uncomfortable recommendations for 28 months. And asked Alice what this said and their behaviour towards this report, and then the way in which it was released, what it says about the Albanese's pathological aversion to transparency.
Yeah, we've seen that in relation to FOIs, not just how few FOIs are granted under this government compared with previous governments, but also in terms of their proposed changes to FOI legislation, making it more expensive. I mean, there is an argument that discretionary appointments can have a role. If you have an ambitious reforming government, then perhaps their appointments would be a little bit more contentious. And so there is potentially an inbuilt conservatism to certain kinds of appointment processes. But it seems as though we currently have the worst of both worlds. So we don't have a good set of transparency and we don't have ambitious reforming appointments. And so really it's a time for change.
It's it is also symptomatic of the duopoly's attitude to power. This is part of the pork barrel, the jobs for mates. And the pork barrel was so overcooked under the last innings of the coalition. We're talking about billions of dollars in electoral bribery. It was corrupt. Of course, the NACC can't be bothered to look into it, but it was a corrupt use of taxpayers' money. And Labor gets in and, oh yeah, we're still handing out money on issues that should be local council issues. It's still straight electoral bribery. Elect us and we will build that bridge across the creek. So there is that total attitude of the whole point of being in politics is, of course, being in power. And when you're in power, the whole point of politics is to stay in power, and you'll do what you will and you reward your mates along the way. Whether you're rewarding a mate with a state funeral, perhaps, after the event, or appointments. I can see, on the other hand, just a little bit on the other hand, is in any organisation, when you have to make appointments, you do look for the people you know and the people you think who could do a good job. The idea that you can have some mob of headhunters to find the perfect person for a job isn't necessarily the right answer. There has to be a degree of flexibility in there. But the final point I'd make is what dumb politics this became. That something that was embarrassing wasn't dealt with. It was allowed to become very embarrassing thanks to David Pocock, thanks to the Senate, which demonstrates again that it's the Senate where leverage exists in the Australian political system now. It's the Senate that counts. The House of Reps is a joke. The numbers are there. Everyone falls into line. There are some good independents who can wave the flag, but they've got zero power. In the Senate, that's where pressure can be exerted, where bills can be blocked, where bills can be dealt with. And that, to run off at a tangent, is why you'd really have to hope the community independence movement somehow or other can get itself together and former Senate ticket. But that would mean becoming a party, and of course they can't become a party because they're an anti-party.
And now we go to Dave's interview with Ogie Simic of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. The Resource Centre commissioned their own translation of an interview with the Nauruan president and a local journalist about the $2 billion plus deal that Australia has just struck with Nauru, which enables us to continue dumping or resume dumping refugees or unwanted refugees back on the tiny island state. After the Albanese government refused to release its own transcript of the interview, citing potential damage to international relations if it were made public, despite the fact that, albeit in a different language, the interview is on the Facebook page of the president. Enjoy that, and afterwards, normal transmission is resumed on the episode.
Ogie Simic of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, David.
I suppose at the top we should just quickly disclose that we do know each other, that we met
do.
in a haze of sleep deprivation, smelly nappies, babies group.
Not ours. Well, that's right. But not
What?
ours smelly nappies, but our kids smelly nappies, right?
Thank you for clarifying that. I was ambiguous in my language. You work for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and something quite interesting and potentially disturbing has come to light recently about our relationship with Nauru, the way we treat refugees, and two very different stories that Australians are hearing and the people of Nauru are hearing. Can you talk us through this, please?
Yeah, totally. It's been a wild few weeks, on top of wild few months. But offshore processing, something that Australia's been using for over a decade now, and it's ruined so many people's lives. It's been a policy that's been implemented. Politicians trying to win a few grubby votes at the expense of thousands of people whose lives have been absolutely destroyed. I mean, the sort of stories that we come across and the sort of things that we hear and see is really, really shocking. It's been an ongoing policy to, when people come to Australia by boat, quite discriminatory, because if you come here by other means, you're treated completely differently. But we've got this thing about boats, and so if you come by boat, you're now sent to Nauru. The numbers on Nauru got very close to zero, and it felt like, this is a couple of years ago, it felt like there was this opportunity to actually end offshore processing, because the numbers on Nauru had got zero, the numbers on PNG, so this is people who Australia has banished there over a decade ago now. I think people there now have been for 12 years, and they're incredibly unwell. There's still 30 refugees who've been left there, and we're fighting for them every day. They need to be medically evacuated and brought here to safety. But there are still, the numbers on Nauru got down to zero. But in the last, it's been almost 2 and a bit years, there's been more people intercepted and sent. There's about 105 people there now. And so the amount of money that Australia has been spending on offshore processing is so hard to comprehend. So at the moment, we're spending around $790 million every year to keep that detention facility open on Nauru. And nominally, that's for about the 105 people who remain there. Now, many multiples of millions of dollars per person, it's costing the Australian taxpayer for people to be, well, effectively tortured on Nauru. At the same time, people might know there's been a raft of laws that have been rushed through Parliament. The way that government did this was so sneaky, introducing legislation very, very late in the piece, just as it's about to be debated, and then guillotining debate, rushing it through Parliament with deals that the government was able to do with the Liberals to get legislation across, which effectively means that in Australia now, and this is the shocking news, we have probably, might be not surprising, but shocking, some of the worst refugee policies of anywhere in the world. The minister and government gave themselves powers recently to send people to any country, so deport people to any third country that Australia pays, to ban entire countries from entering Australia. So the minister, not Parliament, not the courts, can at any moment decide that an entire group of people from a country is no longer able to even in any way come into Australia. We have made it possible for the minister to take people's mobile phones away if they're in detention, and the list goes on. It's really, really, really terrible stuff. The reason I'm sharing all of this with you is because we've now actually started ripping people out of our community under a multi-billion-dollar deal. This is on top of the $790 million that I've spoken about, a multi-billion-dollar deal that we know absolutely nothing about. The government has remained tight-lipped about it, and has not been able to divulge any details. But we are now ripping people out of our community, sometimes in the middle of the night. So probably quite similar scenes to what you're seeing play out in the US with ICE, and sending people to Nauru.
And this is an escalation. This hasn't happened prior.
No, no, it's a wild escalation. We've, as a country, not had this before, where we are taking people who are actually part of our community and sending them to a place like Nauru. So it's an escalation. It's, yeah, $2.5 billion to $7 billion deal. We don't know the exact details, but that's what we were able to find out through a hearing that took place as the bill was being rushed through Parliament, at a hearing where only the Department of Home Affairs was allowed to provide evidence, and nobody else. So a very rushed, and faulty process. And the thing, David, is that we know is that whenever there is secrecy and lack of transparency, it breeds corruption and abuse. And that's what's happening here. I've kind of been thinking of this house of cards built on corruption. Now that all these cards are being pulled out, we find out more and more. So just to bring back to what you originally asked me about, the transcript, which reveals a very different story being told on Nauru to the one that's being told to people here in Australia, is a interview that the Nauruan president gave to media in February. It's available online on social media, but we have been really struggling to get a translation of that. People who look at it, who speak Nauruan, which is very few people in the world, usually really worried about translating it, because there's a well-known cycle of retribution towards people from government on Nauru. The government had a copy of the transcript, and Senator David Pocock asked for that transcript, a copy, to be made public under FOI, and was told no go by the government. They refused to release it under FOI. It then, through Senator David Shoebridge, who put through an order for production of documents in the Senate. So this is now like legislation in the Senate. It's actually that the Senate agrees that they have to release this information. They refused to do that twice. And the second time, Minister Penny Wong got up and said that there's a suppression order, meaning that they can't release that document. We then spent quite a long period trying to figure out what this suppression order extends to. And finally, last week, we were able to have Senator Shoebridge and Senator David Pocock, two senators, standing side by side, reading out half the transcript each into the Parliament, which reveals that the president of Nauru is saying to the people of Nauru, the people that are being sent here from Australia are people who may have done something wrong in their past, but they've been living in the community and living their lives peacefully, and they're going to continue living their lives peacefully here. Our government's telling us that these are people we should be worried about and we should be concerned about, and that's why they're sending them there. The president of Nauru has also said that if possible, of course, he'll look for a way for those people to be sent back to where they've come from. Now, given the fact that most of these people are either refugees or stateless, that is a breach of international law. And it seems like, for Australia to be engaging in something like that, it's like a backdoor exit for people back to danger of where they've come from through Nauru. And the third thing is that, he said that they've been working on this for over a year, which is very different to the story that Minister Tony Burke has painted here in Australia.
So Australians are being told these people are dangerous. Nauruans are being told these people are not. My question, I suppose, then is, are we subcontracting out to weaker countries our human rights abuses?
Yes.
I
Yeah,
thought that
absolutely.
might
I
be
mean,
the case, because that's what it looks like.
that's exactly what's going on here, and it's really hard to fathom, because these are people who there are people who may have done something wrong in their lives in the past, but some of those people are people who came to Australia at a very young age, perhaps, and maybe did something wrong as young, really traumatized people who've escaping abuse. But in all instances, they're people who have served an original sentence. But unlike everyone else who gets to come back and be integrated into the community and be part of the community, every year I think it's 7,000 people leave the correction system in Australia, part of our community again. For people who are refugees, the Minister for Immigration in Australia has the power to cancel people's protection findings, so to take away their refugee status, and has been able to then put them in detention. And everyone we speak to tells us that the actual detention facilities that people are in are far worse than being in jail. And sometimes these same people have then been in detention, immigration detention, arbitrary immigration detention for up to 3 times the original sentence. They were released last year when the High Court decided that people couldn't, lo and behold, can't be held indefinitely in immigration detention. They were released. And instead of helping support people back into the community, some of those people the government punished so much, on the whole group, they put in these curfews where it meant that they couldn't find work, they couldn't really find ways to support themselves, they couldn't really engage with their families. For some people, they put ankle bracelets on their legs, which is a really drastic measure to take. And now, those same people that have been punished so many times already, they are effectively giving a life sentence to and sending them to Nauru on these 30-year visas. Now, Nauru, for anyone that doesn't know, is the size of Melbourne Airport. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny island where there is no work opportunities, particularly not if you're a refugee, because the society isn't very kind towards people who come from different places. And definitely no tertiary hospitals, for example, and for people who might suffer from acute illnesses or mental health issues. It's not a place where they're going to go and live effective and productive lives.
All of this stuff the last 2 years has happened under ALP governance. There seems to be some sort of misunderstanding, a cognitive dissonance in this country that the ALP is somehow nicer to refugees. That's not been my experience. In fact, it's the reason why I've never been able to vote for them. What's it been your experience?
Well, yeah, in fact, if you look at some of the most drastic and toxic and abusive refugee policies that we've had implemented, they've actually been implemented under Labor governments. You have to remember that it was Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd that restarted offshore processing, and Kevin Rudd who implemented the policy that people who come here by boat will never be able to resettle in our community. And now under Tony Burke, who used to be immigration minister, now is Home Affairs Minister with the immigration portfolio, we have had the worst refugee policies implemented that you can imagine. And to give you an example of the mobile phone ban, banning mobile phones from people in detention, it's a cynical ploy because they don't want people to reveal what's actually happening in those places. In fact, the way that our community has been able to find out what's going on has been through people being able to document their experiences. So they're ripping away people's mobile phones. They're signing these $2.5 billion deals with Nauru that we don't know anything about. And in fact, what we do know about, just a couple of months ago, we had a acting assistant secretary in the Department of Home Affairs become a whistleblower, risking jail time to come forward and say, well, actually, what I experienced was corruption within the Department of Home Affairs. We knew that money was being embezzled and was going to corporations and companies that were buying expensive sports cars, and that money was going into people's pockets. And we still let that happen. And then we had another whistleblower come forward to say that actually the money that Australia has given has gone to the Finks Bikie gang. So Bikie is to provide security and policing services on Nauru. So and that whistleblower talked about the close relationship with the AFP and the bikies. So there's, like I said before, wherever there is this much secrecy, it just breeds corruption and abuse, and that's what the system's built on, under a Labor government.
The Trump administration has, in the last week or two, asked US embassies in its vassal states like Australia to collect data on immigrant crime in these countries. I wonder this whole web of demonizing people that aren't
Yeah.
white, if this is linked in any way. Like our refugee system, Trump said that, oh my God, you guys are worse than we are.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, some of the laws that I was talking about before, I think probably set Donald Trump salivating. It's really hard to believe the sort of laws we've given ourselves in this country. Look, I think globally we're seeing instances of where a small number of greedy billionaires is using their power and influence to divide communities and make us fearful of one another so that they can distract people from the real problems that we're facing. And the real problems is the fact that, the global international legal order that we've built is collapsing. And we've got rich people. I mean, Elon Musk about to become a trillionaire, which is probably worth than I don't know how many countries put together. um, that's the real problem, and that's what's going on. And in places like the US and Australia, those people are demonizing refugees and people seeking asylum because that's really easy to do, and migrants in exactly the same way to distract us from what's really going on.
Where are most of these refugees from?
Well, most of the people who ASRC works with and supports are from all of the major conflicts that we're seeing across the world. At the moment, we have a large number of people from places like Syria. We support a large number of families from Gaza. We work with a lot of people from Afghanistan. And, Afghanistan is the place where Australia was directly involved in the conflict there for over 20 years.
Mhm.
And now, wherever there is conflict, it breeds and it creates refugees. And it's people who have nothing to do with those conflicts that are most impacted. And they're the people that we see through our doors at the ASRC.
So the big web is that we contribute to 2 decades worth of war crimes, create a bunch
Yes,
of refugees that try to make their
yes.
way here, and then we ship them off to basically indefinite detention in a third country so we can abrogate ourselves of our responsibilities under international law and outsource our human rights abuses.
Yes, that's certainly part of the picture. But the whole immigration system in Australia is built on so much discrimination, depending on where you've come from, when you've come to Australia, how you've come to Australia, depends on how you enter the immigration system and where you eventually end up. But we work with families who, for over a decade, have been waiting for their applications to be processed. We work with people who've been sent to Nauru who are on Papua New Guinea. And there are so many stories of where people's lives have been destroyed. And we know that the alternative is much better. The alternative, what my family experienced when we came to Australia under the humanitarian program, we had access to education, we had access to be able to rebuild our lives. As a result, I was able to go on and study law at university, which led me to so many different opportunities in my life. And we know that when people start a new life here in Australia, they work so hard to make the most of it. And you don't have to, there's places in Melbourne, if you walk through the streets of Dandenong, you see the richness that migration, refugees have brought to community, and the way that our community is underpinned by that.
This is a radical notion, Augie. You're not just saying that we could torture refugees cheaper, you're saying we don't need to torture them at all.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Bold thinking.
exactly.
What can Australians that aren't scared of different people do to help you and your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the moment we're running our end of year appeal. So if people have a few spare dollars, that goes to fund our advocacy, but also our service provision. We support over 8,000 people through our doors every year. But if people would like to get involved with some of our advocacy, the only reason these sorts of systems are able to flourish is if people aren't paying attention to what's going on. So if we work together, raise awareness of what's going on, and make it really clear to government that this is out of step with where our community is, and it is out of step. We done a round of polling in February. We got this polling before the election that showed that the majority of Australians want fairness and compassion when it comes to refugees and people seeking asylum, that we see ourselves as people that embrace others, which really puts our government out of step with our community. And we need to make that very clear to government that that is the case.
So terrible, really, to see it all set out so bluntly by Ogie. It does seem that our refugee policy from way back, Labor's response, I guess, to Howard's refugee policy was just born of straight terror after their 2001 loss, that they would be accused of being soft on refugees. And then particularly after Rudd's amendments to the policy caused, as it was alleged, the boats to start. Since then, they have just tried to be harder, tougher, meaner than the coalition at all times, to our great cost. And we're seeing that play out again on Nauru, Michael.
Exactly, Joe. Look, I'd like to add just one other perspective on this.
Yeah.
From Nauru's point of view. Here is this tiny little country, 13,000 people, 21 square kilometres, 80% of it uninhabitable. The place was exploited and raped for half a century by primarily the UK and Australia. Then for a quarter of a century, they were actually allowed to price their phosphate properly, and then they're bankrupt pretty quickly. Now you've got this little desperate island that we are using and abusing as a penal colony. We're back to where we were 227 years ago, except there's no future on that tiny, desolate island for these people who are being sent there. And look, not all the people being sent to Nauru are nice people. There are some people there who are not nice, being dropped into this little island society of 13,000 people. And we're saying, oh, well, we're the old colonial power. We don't care. You're bribable. You're desperate. Take some money and take our rubbish for us. And that is another reason for us to be embarrassed in the South Pacific.
Look, it really is. Alice, you've just edited or co-edited with your colleague Anna Chang a book through the Australian Institute Press called A Time for Bravery: What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage. And there's lots of great essays in there that we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But just on the issue of refugees and race more broadly, Yanis Varoufakis and Sazonke Msamang write on this in the book. And it seems that were it not for a deep-seated racism that exists within Australia, this kind of policy where we discard people as refuse onto, as Michael says, these very desperate, tiny, bankrupt patch of land in Nauru, it's incredible that it's gone on this long, and that even now we continue to, under this cloak of extreme secrecy, behave in these ways.
Yeah, the cruelty isn't an accident. The cruelty is the point here. The idea of treating these people so badly and using them as a way to dissuade others from coming is really reprehensible. And, we talked a bit about the Trump administration and how poorly they're behaving and how they're ignoring the rules-based order. Now, yes, that's at a different order of magnitude than what Australia's doing, but we have our own instances here of ignoring the rules-based order. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this book. We have a government that's been elected with a huge majority, and there are so many things that they could do. There's so much legislation they could pass if only they chose. And so what we did was we asked a bunch of big thinkers what kind of bravery they would like to see. In some cases, they look to the past, and in other cases, they're looking to the future. For Yanis Varoufakis, he tells this really incredible story. It's so moving, I mean, in the way that only Yanis could tell a story, about a survivor of the Pinochet regime who he met in London and who was in hospital at one point, having taken up skydiving. Now, the reason why he'd taken up skydiving and he'd hurt himself so badly he'd broken a bunch of bones was because he was planning to head back to his country, and he was planning to stand up for his people. Now, this is someone who came to the UK as a refugee, and under some of Australia's really cruel policies, he wouldn't have had a chance to come here. And so Yanis's point is that Australia as a country, we're depriving ourselves from all sorts of people who otherwise could come here and could be part of this incredibly diverse, wide-ranging country and contribute to our society. I don't want to fall into, too much exceptionalism and saying that refugees can only be incredible people who are saving the world. But this is at the heart of the point that Yanis is making, is we're missing out on so much, and at the same time, we're not living up to our obligations under international law.
Yeah. And it does seem that from Sazonke's perspective, the way that we treat people who are different, we may not be aware of it for those of us who have been living here for a while, but as a South African woman coming in who had just lived through both apartheid and the dismantling of apartheid, and importantly in her essay, the reckoning of South Africa with its past, she was struck immediately by the racism that bubbles away beneath the surface. And she attributes that to some degree to the fact that we have failed to grapple with our history. And until we do, we cannot move forward in an open, accepting and appropriate manner.
Yeah, and we have failed to reckon with our history in so many different ways. Yes, it is in terms of the colonial past, so recognising the hideous massacres, for example, and to a degree there has been some redress in that. There's a new book out on Australia's frontier wars, for example. So there's addressing the colonial history, but there's also the importance of recognizing the times in our history when we have been brave. So there are times when Australia has been a leader, and it's important to recognize those times in order to consider just how brave we can be in the future. A good example of that is Stephen Long's piece about the green bans in Sydney, for example.
Yeah, that was a great piece.
It's kind of hard to imagine right now the idea of construction workers banding together and saying, we won't be part of this process. But imagine if that were to be the case. Imagine if constructed workers said, no, we refuse to be part of this project because it is environmentally ruinous or because it's going to completely undermine communities. I think a lot of people have so much more power than they give themselves credit for. And so the ability to organize and the ability to bring about change is really with everybody. It's just a question of choosing it.
Well, I think that was one of the really interesting points in the book, because many of the prescriptions that were being proposed absolutely draw on the idea that the power is within us and that, in fact, nobody else is coming along to do it. Because, Joel, as you say, or as Dave and Ogie were talking about just before, is when we're being let down by a Labor government, when we had hoped that change would come with the election of a Labor government, and in fact they are still behaving in ways that not just jeopardise our commitment to human rights, but are jeopardising indeed our very existence with their ongoing approval of fossil fuel expansion. There is no one else to turn to. And, Josh Bornstein is talking about the power of corporations. Michelle O'Neill's talking about what unionism can do. So it does come down to we need to be brave together and get on with it.
Yeah, totally. And I think Oggy made a really, really prescient remark there about Kevin Rudd and that era of kind of the Labor Party joining that bipartisan blob in its entirety. I mean, up until then, there was some daylight between Labor and its counterpart, which really changed after that moment, particularly after they'd sort of, ceded to the narrative on the global war on terror as well. And it was that period afterwards that really saw the bipartisan political class preserving the neoliberal economy that we live in right now. And I think the book that Alice is putting together and releasing is one of the most fantastic things that can be put out at the moment, because courage is something that has eluded us in the neoliberal age. And it's actually made the political parties join with each other as a bit of a nexus of neoliberalism at the expense of us, at the public and national interest. And we're seeing it across, our entire society. Richard put in a really good little chapter about neoliberalism as well, where he sort of spoke about, the central promise of neoliberalism being, if you let everyone chase their own narrow goals, the invisible hand will somehow guide us to a better future. But, I look at like the US right now, and I saw Michael Dell, who the Empire man from Dell Computers, and his partner trying to address this end stage neoliberalism and trying to create some kind of public interest in it by offering like a seed account with a couple of $100 for every newborn American child as a way of being able to, onboard them into the end stage neoliberalism. And a similar thing happens over here, but really, this is at the expense of grand national projects that can actually help us. So instead of channeling Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for example, and the New Deal and all the things that needed to be put in place to act as a viable alternative to socialism and communism, then there's nothing in place except for just a little chop out here. And I just really, think here in Australia, we've been running with these sort of bipartisan corporate government projects from the NDIS to childcare to build to rent. And right now we are stuck in this kind of this interlinking between the private and the government classes that comes at the expense of all Australians. And really the only way to deal with it is to hit it in the jugular and start fighting it and challenging it at the coalface. Because, I think most Australians are starting to have a gut full of it. And potentially Alice's book can delineate what the courage is what courage is needed to essentially, navigate our way out of this.
And a lot of that's in the public sector. So, Frank Bongiorno talks about housing policy in the past and how if only we were to match that, then we could make an extraordinary difference to people's lives. But we've also talked quite a bit about the public service and questions of transparency in this episode. And Polly Hemming's essay on this is really excellent. As a former public servant herself, she's talking about the importance of public servants who have become so accustomed to this idea that they can't talk, that they can't act, that they are cowed. And I think we're going to start to see more whistleblowers, as we had in this Nauru story, coming out and saying, this isn't okay, this doesn't fit with the tenets of the public service, and really being frank and fearless rather than just accepting the status quo.
I mean,
being a whistleblower. So being a whistleblower does take enormous bravery, because we all see what nearly always happens to them. The other aspect in Stephen Long's chapter that you mentioned, it would now be illegal for a union to strike for a green ban for a carbon change reason. And that right to strike for such issues was taken away by a Labor government as part of the whole origin of the Labor Party was to politically represent the Labor movement, and now it's divorced. At the same time, on the other side of politics, the moderate force that was within the Liberal Party, basically the leadership quit along with Malcolm Turnbull, and then the leftover leadership then quit at the next election, and now there's a handful of dregs who really don't count. I don't know why they continue to get media coverage as if they do count, because there are so few of them with so little weight, that you've had both sides of politics losing whatever bravery there did exist within them for change. And I'd turn to Sophie Scamp's chapter. I think there's bravery in the community independence movement. If we are looking for political bravery, that's where we're seeing it. People in the community banding together, doing it for themselves, and putting up good people prepared to have a crack.
Yeah, well, I think that was interesting is that across the book, there's a range of different ways in which people are coming together and deciding to try and make a difference. And the independence movement and Sophie Scomp's essay outlines that, that is a possible strategy. And then there are, as Michelle is saying, and indeed Josh Bernstein doesn't so much say this in his essay, but in his broader book, Working for the Brand, it's like when the corporations are this big and this strong, then the only way that they can be taken on effectively is a mass movement. And the most efficient way of doing that is through unionism, and that there has in fact been an uptick in union membership for the first time in decades, Alice, which I had not been aware of before reading that essay.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the way unionism is being picked up in different industries as well. As someone who has a background in book publishing, there's been, for the first time, an enterprise bargaining agreement at Penguin Random House that came through a couple of years ago. But in terms of organising, there's also a great chapter from Naomi Hodgson of Rising Tide. I don't know if you saw this past weekend.
Festival, which was not a word I'd heard of before, which I love.
Yeah. And there's also a piece from Jim Casey, who's a firefighter. And he talks about how when you're a firefighter, it might seem like it's brave, but you have all of the equipment, you have all of the training, you know that your co-workers are going to be there for you. And actually what he finds harder, what he thinks is more brave, is door knocking and being part of a political campaign. And so it's about reframing some of those ideas about what bravery is, but also reminding people that it's a choice. It's always a choice. And I'm trying to be a bit hopeful. Sean Kelly has been saying that maybe because this is the second year of the Albanese government coming up, we'll see some braver options coming onto the table. So for the last term, the braver options came up in year 2, and that's what I'm really hoping for in the next year, is to see some brave action from the government in the next year, especially on climate. And maybe the passage of the EPBC will be a little bit of a boon. Not to say that the legislation is perfect, but to say that seeing some kind of progress on that could signal an opportunity for more change.
Although they very deliberately excluded the climate trigger, and really, how can you protect the environment and even biodiversity of species when climate itself is wreaking such havoc? And we saw that this week with the terrible floods that have been just devastating Sri Lanka and Indonesia in particular, Thailand as well. There's 1,400 people have died, over 1 million people have been displaced, and this is all about the warming oceans and the way that cyclones are now coming down unimpeded, more dramatic ways, more frequently, and without protection of the wind shears, for example. So one of the essays also talks about, and this is, I think, Leanne's contribution, that bravery may no longer be enough. Not saying we don't have to try and, keep courage, but that we actually need to be looking at adapting behaviours as well at this point.
Yeah, this is one of those discussions about reckoning with Australia's place in the world. When you're talking about what's happening in Sri Lanka, Australia is one of the top exporters of emissions. All of our fossil fuels, while we don't burn them all here, they are being burnt, and that's our contribution to global heating. So paying attention to that and taking responsibility for that is an important first step. But yeah, something that comes up across a lot of the essays, and in Leanne Minshall's as well, is about community, about how we can collaborate. And yes, we simply must fight hard to get better action on climate change. and also pay attention to how communities will be working together to deal with the effects, which are not coming in the future. They're here now.
And also, let's think about how we can even think about addressing climate change when we are supporting, a continental war in Europe, when we are also arming, sending components and giving economic, diplomatic, and military normalcy with Israel, that we are tacitly agreeing that there could be Monroe 2.0 wars in Latin America that we might be a part of. How can we even think about these grand ideas that require courage when we can't even go a bit of spine to say, hey, we don't want to be involved in extrajudicial killings off the coast of Venezuela, or even just so much like, say, Peter Malinauskas, who comes across as a more kind of progressive element of our bipartisan class, that's puts in these draconian laws to stop climate protesters on behalf of his mate Tom Katsounis, who's one of the largest petro shills in Australia. And when we have our bipartisan political class tied up with the neoliberal economic titans, which rule over our country with an iron fist, there has to be more than courage. There has to be, as you say, Joe, a national movement. And Alice, I wanted to ask you a little bit is how can we transfer our courage from these kind of ideas we have on the shitter or these things that we talk about down at the pub to actually having us working together as an entity to fight against, what seems to be a locked up, sort of caper right now?
I think the first step is, while it's really tempting to feel apathetic or fatalistic, it's recognizing that we're still a democratic country and every person has a really valuable vote. But there are so many different ways people can organize. I mean, we saw, for example, the protest for Palestine on the Harbour Bridge earlier this year. Now, while there were plenty of people who said protest isn't important, protest doesn't work, hey, guess what happened the week after that? And it's the Albanese government recognizing Palestine. Now, that shows just how powerful these movements can be. It's people organizing and affecting change. So there's one example, is being part of that. But really participation in so many of the different aspects of our political system is really important. Michael mentioned Sophie Scomp's essay and people being involved in the community independent movement. So that's part of it. But also, putting in submissions to government inquiries, while it may be the case that the government tries to ignore it, so long as the reports are written, that's at least the first step. Maintaining that pressure, banding together, having these conversations with people. It seems that the first step is the conversation, and then the more people that we can persuade and mobilize, then the more chance there is of actually affecting change. But the moment that you accept that nothing can be done, the moment that you accept that the cause is hopeless, then that's when we've lost. So it really is about mobilizing, about taking action, about finding community and working together. And I wasn't able to go to Rising Tide, but I was so heartened to see just how wide-ranging the groups of people were, people of all ages, and collaborating in all sorts of different ways. So while membership in all different kinds of organizations has been on the decline for a long time, not just unions, but if you look at things like people being members of their local church group or political party, it seems so important now more than ever to join and be involved in order to affect change, because a single person can't. Every now and then there's an outlier, but for the most part, it's people working together who affect change.
And Michael, it's interesting, isn't it, that reading, for example, John Hewson's contribution is that politicians often seem to find their courage once they've left office.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah. Michael, did you have a comment on that?
Busick, and others. He hasn't left office, he's just on the backbench. Yeah, look, it's wonderful wisdom when you're not trying to climb the greasy pole. I remember a schoolmate who was interested in changing the world and thought, how could he do it? Well, it'd be a really good thing to be a teacher and that'd be positive. But then, of course, you become a teacher and, well, you can't do much as a teacher. You need to be a subject master, and there's the system. And then as a subject master, well, no, you need to be a headmaster. That's where the power is. But then you're answering to the department. If you keep waiting, it's all over too long and you're gone. And the politicians who find perspective and wisdom when they're no longer trying to climb another rung on the pole, it's self-evident.
Sometimes people come to Australia Institute events and they say, this is great, this is all well and good, but what about everyone else? And why are you only preaching to the converted? And, well, we do dozens of events, so many every year, and we use the same system as churches have done for many years. The converted and the faithful come in every Sunday and they get the good word and then they spread it out into the world. And they wouldn't have been doing that for all those centuries if it didn't work.
Well, no, and I think the thing is that you actually have to start the conversations, you set the debate, and that way the Overton window can be shifted back. And I think that the Australia Institute has a very strong record of doing that, and I think that this book will be another big contributor to hopefully that more progressive shift and mainstreaming some of those very important ideas.
And if I can,
please.
If I can offer viewers of the Shot discount for our book, if you use Shot 5, as in Shot, the numeral 5, on our website, australiainstitute.org.au, we'll give you $5 off.
Oh, look at that. That's our very first special
Just in time for Christmas
promo code. Yeah, just in time for Christmas. It is a very handy gift for those people that you don't know what to buy for. So I recommend that, Shot 5 on the Australia Institute's website. We have, alas, reached the end of another episode. I want to thank Alice for making her debut with us and Michael for joining us, and Joel, of course, for being co-host duties. Before we go, we do like to ask our guests if they have a top tip that they would like to make for our viewers, something that's caught your eye last week or coming up. Alice, anything from you?
Oh, well, just thinking of Christmas presents, I think Salvage by Jennifer Mills is a great pick. It's a novel. It's about a post-climate catastrophe Australia. It's a great page-turner, but it's also excellent climate fiction. So
and
you could...
Jennifer is a very fine South Australian author I can endorse. Michael, top tip from you?
Oh, it's hardly a tip with the Reserve Bank meeting coming up this week, and everyone knows the rates are going to stay the same. Yeah. One thing I'd say about that is that in the aviary of Reserve Bank animals, people normally just talk about the doves and the hawks. The real Reserve Bank animal is an emperor penguin that just sits pat upon the egg and doesn't move. The Reserve Bank, I think, despite all the headlines and a lot of speculation now about the next move is going to be up and panic on any set of figures, I think we're in for a lot of sitting pat as the penguins rule at the Reserve Bank. And don't become too scared by each flutter of headlines about every statistic which is, that's unexpected. It's not. The one key thing, I'm squeezing this in as well, I have a confession to make. At the last Reserve Bank meeting, I missed the main story. Everyone else did too, thank heavens. No, not quite. Glenn Dyer and Bernard Keane at Crikey saw it. And that is, on the Reserve Bank's forecasts, we are in another year of negative real wages. People are going backwards. Don't miss that when you see headlines about GDP growth being a little bit here and inflation being a little bit there. The reality is, we're back to having falling living standards for the average Australian.
And that was something that Labor certainly had promised to tackle and had done some work on in terms of supporting wage increases, the Commission, and legislating for some through some of the care industries that they have input into. But for the bulk of people going backwards again, that's not good news going into 26. Joel, from you.
Just a couple of things. It triggered me, the green bands, the post-green bands world that we live in. Please note, if you live in Melbourne, that Mary Beck Council are putting up 15 towers in my cultural heartland of Coburg, where I was born and raised. And these towers are, essentially a cultural and environmental anvil that are just being dropped in by a developer and a council. So get on board that if you live in Melbourne's north. And also, if you're looking for something to do with the kids this weekend, in in Caulfield, there is a Mossad-themed exploding pager party that's going on there, organised by the Lions of Zion, which for some reason has been reported in the mainstream press or banned by the police or the local council. So, yeah, get down there with your kids where they'll be simulating Nerf gun battles and celebrating, the notorious pager explosions in Lebanon. So, yeah, get down on Sunday to your park in Caulfield.
Wow, that's all going on in Melbourne, for better or indeed worse. Thank you all for for joining us for another Sunday Shot. Next week is our final episode for the year. Dave will be back. We'll be launching our merch, which is another great Christmas opportunity. T-shirts, totes designed by the fabulous Fiona Katausis. If you're so inclined, like, subscribe, do all those things, throw a few dollars our way, because we'd love to come back again next year. But have a good week, everyone.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you.